All right, we're back. Here we go. This is going to be a bit of a review here. For those of you, for most of you, it should be a review. This is the classical conditioning stuff. Some of you may not have had this since introductory psychology. Some of you may not even had introductory psychology. And I know some of you haven't heard about this stuff at all. So, it should be a review, but it might not be. So, if you're an expert in classical conditioning, then zip through the lecture and pick up some of the stuff towards the end. But it still might be useful to listen to the whole thing to kind of refresh your memory. So here we go. Oh, sorry. I was waiting for the stimulus to start and it was already there. Ha 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 ha. Bad Watsonian joke. In other words, this is the stuff that Watson thought controlled all our behavior, but it's not. Okay, I'm just going to qualify that right now. This is not something that controls all our behavior. However, we all do behave in a classically conditioned fashion, meaning that we all have classical conditioning is going on within all of us. It's pretty much a widespread phenomenon across all species. Right? It's huge. And this is a really basic thing, and it explains a fair amount of behavior, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain some of the more complex stuff that we're going to deal with. Again, all species show this. There's a few that don't, but we're talking like, I don't know, aplasia. Well, even they show some basic classical conditioning, but we'll deal with that later. Anyway, all right, define. Classical conditioning is the change in behavior. Okay. Shoot, that's an awful definition. It's kind of hard to define off the top of my head. I don't have a really good definition for you, but because I tend to confuse parts of classical conditioning, because as you learn more about it, you start to realize there's a lot of overlap between it and operant conditioning, and they are separate procedures, but they can sometimes kind of cover the same area. So I tend to, in my head, I've just never really come up with a really, really clean definition. So anyway, basically the idea is that in the environment there are stimuli. Stimuli are linked to responses within the organism. It's basically like a reflex, right? So we're going to link our, if something is classically conditioned, we'll be able to identify some stimulus in the environment that elicited this change. And notice I use the word elicited. Okay, elicited is chosen purposefully because what we're talking about here is a type of reflex. Right? This is a behavioral reflex. And here I am, and I'm not even really talking about the right thing. That's respondent stuff. I'm looking ahead in my slides. Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. Anyway, I was looking ahead in my slides, and I'm looking on the next slide here, and I was talking about reflexes, and then I look up, and I'm like, well, the slide I'm on is actually about defining behavior. Anyway, so behavior. So let's go back and do that. So anyway, behavior defined is basically any action, right, that is done by an organism. It must be linked to the environment, and there must be measurable change. In other words, I must be able to see that you've done something. Now, granted, we've already talked about those private events, right? So private events are a little bit different. They are linked to the environment, but no one else can observe them, only you, right? A response is another word for behavior, right? A response class gets a little more challenging. Think about how many different ways I could turn on a light bulb. Well, let me try that again. Think about how many different ways I could flip on the light switch. I don't know how you turn on a light bulb. That just seems kind of inappropriate somehow. That would actually bother me if you could turn on a light bulb. Anyway, never mind. So response class is what we actually deal with in behavior analysis. We typically don't deal with one individual, very discrete behavior. We deal with response classes. And response classes are, like I was saying, think about how many different ways you can flip on the light switch. You can use your hand. You can use the back of your hand. You can use the front of your hand. You could use this finger. You can use that finger. You could use your elbow. You could use your ear. You could use your butt. You could do all sorts of stuff to flip that light switch. They all produce the same outcome. The light switch has been flipped, and the light hopefully is on or off now, right? So that response class is what's being strengthened, not the individual response. So let's say I walk up and I want to turn on the lights, my hands are full, so I use my butt. So I bump my butt up against the light switch and off, and the lights come on. Did the light coming on strengthen me using my butt? No, it really just strengthened me turning on the lights. Okay? The light switch still works, it still turns on, so anything that I can do to turn on that light will be strengthened. Repertoire, that's all the behaviors that you're able to engage in. That's a behavioral repertoire. Okay? And we can add to the repertoire. We can sometimes take away from the repertoire. That gets a little challenging. But things in the repertoire are context specific. Sometimes you can do something in one environment but not in another. I'll find a very interesting one that I see all the time is that I end up with a lot of people. I work on a lot of master's theses and things like that, and one of the things I see often is that some people are very, very, very good at verbalizing something, right? Whatever that is, a complex argument or a philosophy or something. But when you ask them to write it, it's a whole different ballgame, even though it's still a verbal response. Words on paper, words in the air, right? But it's context specific. Sometimes people can do really well verbally, but written, they're just not good at all, right? And that's okay. That's because behavior is context specific. And we often learn how to talk at a much more accurate and effective and complex level than we learn how to write. And it sounds crazy to think that if you can talk it, that might not mean you can write it. But it's true. It's a very challenging thing. And part of the reason is that we write much differently than we speak. And there's reasons for that, and it's important, but we also need to learn to express ourselves in that written form. So we have to strengthen the repertoire of writing, even when the verbal repertoire is already there. This is something I've struggled with for a long time. Anyway, it's one of those things. All right, let's look at respondent behavior here. Of course, we've got the traditional Pavlov's dog. On Facebook recently, there was a picture going around about Pavlov's cat. And they're joking about how you couldn't train them. But of course, Pavlov's cat is completely trainable. All species respond to this stuff. Okay? Again, they're reflexes, and all we're going to do is modify those reflexes. Right? That's what respondent behavior, or classical conditioning is we're going to condition those responses. That dog is drooling, not because somebody's sitting there with a steak in front of him, but because they've paired something with that steak. And that something is probably present in front of the dog. Maybe it's just the person. So when we talk about respondent conditioning, we're basically saying that that we are changing reflexes. Let's get into the terminology here. Unconditional stimulus. This is the stimulus that you do not need to learn anything about. Hot fire is an unconditional stimulus. You don't need to learn that it hurts. It just hurts. Neutral stimulus. This is something you know nothing about right now. I could hold my pen up right here and show you that the pen is just a pen. Right? And until you've had some experience, that pen means nothing. And even right now, if I hold up this pen, and I'm holding up a pen, right? So this pen serves probably, for most of you, no respondent purpose. In other words, it's neutral from a, from a reflex perspective. But I could turn it into something called a conditional stimulus. A conditional stimulus is something that started out as a neutral stimulus that eventually elicits a reflex. A neutral stimulus does not elicit a reflex. This pen does not elicit a reflex. But I could pair that sound with something that does. So in other words, I could pair this sound with an unconditional stimulus and get this sound to produce a reflex. When this sound produces a reflex, then it is now called a conditional stimulus. The conditional reflex, or the conditional response, is what happens in the presence of the conditional stimulus. So in other words, if, actually we've got some pictures here, so let's take a look at it. This is a cute bastardization of what Watson did with the little Albert experiment, right? So basically with the little Albert experiment, and you can go to YouTube and look it up if you want. So the little Albert experiment is on YouTube. Anyway, if you look at that, you'll get the actual video of the original. He didn't use a white bunny, okay? He used other stuff. But the idea is I just needed something cute for the lecture. So if you take an infant and you let them play with a white bunny or a dog or a mask or a furry creature, whatever, they almost don't even care that they're there, right? Because there's no learning history. So the fuzzy creatures that Watson had used were neutral stimuli. Okay? And he had a dog, he had burning newspaper, believe it or not. So burning newspaper isn't a problem until you pair the fire with the heat, with the burn and all that stuff. Anyway, so unconditional stimuli are things that you don't need to learn to respond to, hunger, that type of stuff. So pain, sex, there's a few others that are out there. So So again, with fear is an unconditional stimulus. So anyway, he takes this little bunny rabbit, and it doesn't elicit any response from the kiddo. And then he decides to pair the bunny rabbit with a loud noise. Right? So he takes a hammer and hits a piece of metal behind the child and presents the rabbit at about the same time. So when he presents the critter with the loud noise, eventually the kid will cry at the presence of the rabbit. That might take a couple of trials, right? But the idea is that the loud noise would cause the kid to cry. It creates a startle response. That's normal. That's unconditional. You didn't have to learn that. That's just a natural reflex. The rabbit by itself didn't do anything. It was neutral. But then Watson and Rayner paired the hammer, or the loud noise, with the rabbit, or the furry creature. And now, in the future, when you present the furry creature to the kid screams. There's no reason for the kid to scream. The furry creature never did anything to it. It was simply paired with the loud noise. So now the conditional reflex is the crying to the presence of the furry creature, right? And the unconditional stimulus is the loud noise. The neutral stimulus was the furry creature. So the conditional stimulus and the neutral stimulus are always the same. It becomes the conditional stimulus the moment you pair the neutral stimulus with an unconditional stimulus. We'll look at this a little bit differently here. Here's another one. An unconditional stimulus is an air puff. So blow a puff of air in your eye. Your unconditional response is an eye blink. A particular sound will not cause you to blink your eyes. However, I could classically condition you by taking and pairing it with and get you to blink your eye. So the procedure would be much like that. And then you'll blink. You'll blink. Do that about 50 times, 100 times or something like that, and then I'll develop a pretty strong response. And eventually all I need to do is go, and you'll blink your eye. Right? So neutral stimulus, the sound, paired with the puff of air, which is an unconditional stimulus, produces an unconditional response, the eye blink. Eventually, the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, and the sound will produce a conditioned response, eye blink. So CS's go with CR's, US's go with UR's. They never cross over. You can't have a US that leads to a CR. A lot of times they look the same, right? In terms of the UR and the CR, but they don't have to. And we'll talk about some scenarios where they don't have to later on. All right, respondent extinction. How do we get rid of this thing? Right? So we're going to present the CS repeatedly. So let's assume that I have conditioned you to the sound of my pen to get you to blink. So what I can do is just present that sound over and over again without ever pairing it with the unconditioned stimulus, and that connection will go away. Right? So I could just do this, and you're going to blink your eyes. I'm going to do it again, and you're going to blink your eyes. And then I'm going to do it, and you don't blink your eyes. Guess what? That was extinction. And eventually you're not going to blink your eyes to that as long as I don't pair it with that unconditional stimulus anymore. Spontaneous recovery tends to happen, though, when you take a break, right? So let's say I trained you on this sound, right? And then I extinguish it, and then I take a 24-hour break. I come back, and I try you again. And guess what? You're going to blink. That's spontaneous recovery. And that length, it's a little counterintuitive. You'd think that the longer the break between your extinction training and when we're going to test for spontaneous recovery, you'd think it would be a weaker response, but in reality it's a bigger response. It's a really odd sort of thing, and a little beyond the scope of this course to talk about why that is. But just know that spontaneous recovery happens, and you have to be aware of it and be watching for it, because even if you extinguish a classically conditioned response, it will come back on you. You have to do multiple extinction procedures, basically. You have to do it over and over again. A lot about this behavior stuff is about repeating things, establishing patterns of responding, and we'll talk about why. It shows up as predictability and correlation and things like that, and it's describable as those anyway. So. All right, excitatory conditioning. We have two different types of respondent conditioning. We have excitatory and inhibitory. So let's look at excitatory first. This is where we're building new things, right? So the CS elicits activity related to the US without the US being present. So the eye blink, right? So the CS elicits activity related to the unconditional stimulus. We're going to get you to blink your eyes, but the blink isn't there. So we added a response to a neutral stimulus. That response was the eye blinking. Okay? Or with the other example, we could say we're going to show fear in the presence of furry creatures. And by the way, that's the way most fears are developed. I'll leave it at that for now. Right? In other words, your system is excited. You're producing something. A response is added. A connection is made. Let's look at how these excitatory conditioning procedures actually happen. Now, what we have here going across the board, we got across the screen. Time goes this direction. Right? So this is the start of whenever. Right? So in short delay conditioning, basically we've got a little bit of an overlap here. Right? So we start the thing, we turn on the conditioned stimulus. Okay, so keep in mind, think of this as your conditioned stimulus. Okay? So we start that, and before we finish it, we turn on the US. So I go. Okay, did you hear that? I started this, and then I blew a puff of air in your eyes. Okay. In the US, I can't blow that long because I'm, anyway, you get the idea. So the US blows for, you'd blow the air for just a little bit longer. So I guess let me redo that. Did it wrong again. It's a little challenging to do, believe it or not, because I'm trying to move my thumb and my lips all at the same time and not make a fool out of myself, which I probably have already done, but that's irrelevant. So anyway, we start that US. The US continues past the completion of the CS. So if we're clicking the pen, we click the pen a couple of times, but continue to blow a puff of air in your eye. Typically, we're speaking with stimulus intervals of less than 1 minute. Long delay conditioning, we turn the CS on for a long time. Okay, so in this case, we have the ISI is 5 to 10 minutes, basically. Right, so we've got a big start. So that CS is there for a long time before we turn on the US. Trace conditioning, this is probably the most effective of all these procedures. We have a conditioned stimulus comes on and then off and then the US. So it sounds like this. And this is why I was having such trouble, is because this is the way I typically do it. That was 3 trials. Right? So that was three trials of that conditioning. Not that you're going to get conditioned because no one's sitting there blowing a puff of air into your eyes. The reason we call this trace conditioning is because there's that memory trace, if you will, that trace interval. So the CS comes on, comes off, and then the US comes on and comes off. Typical ISIs here, less than a minute, half a second is great. There's another procedure, simultaneous, where you present the CS and the US at exactly the same time. You'd seem to think that there would be good conditioning to this, but in reality there's not. It's not very effective at all. And why are we going to, how do we measure that? Well, we can measure it by seeing if the conditioned stimulus actually produces the conditioned response. And what you see is that it doesn't. It takes a high number of trials to make this work. And basically, as you'll see in a little bit, this is all due to predictability. There's no predictability here. The CS doesn't predict anything, right? And so we have to get to that prediction, and we'll come up to that in a minute. How do we measure these things? It's really straightforward. The magnitude of the magnitude of the conditioned response, the strength, right? How intensely did you blink your eyes? How many times did you blink your eyes? The probability. What's the likelihood that a conditioned stimulus is going to produce a conditioned response? Is it going to do it 100% of the time, 80% of the time, 60% of the time? What you'll find is that the more trials you have, the higher the probability is. Latency. CS and then the CR, or CS and then the CR. Right? So those things measured, those are different ways in which we can measure it. So the latency between the CS and the conditioned response is one measure. All right, inhibitory. All right, kind of a cute little picture here. Rather than the devil you know than the devil you don't, basic point is simple. Predictability is powerful. So what we're going to do here is we're going to break a connection to something, and this can be a challenge, right? Or we're going to show I'm sorry, I'm not going to break a connection. We're going to show a lack of connection between things. So signaling the absence of an unconditional stimulus. A library signals to you that there will be no loud noises. That's what it signals to you. So in that case, you're basically calming yourself down. So the library is a safe place. It's not going to be loud. There's not going to be a lot of auditory stimuli, at least in the past. And it might be a little different now because of the new things that are going on in the library, but you get the idea. I've been up on a mountain a couple of times, and over near the Panhandle Gap up on Mount Rainier, there's a shelter. And I tell you, when you've been hiking up there and you're in the snow zone, you're above the tree line, and even in August it's cold, right? And the wind is out there, it's ripping, and it's not comfortable out, and you see that shelter and kind of you just get flush. It's like, it's there, right? So you go up and then you go into the shelter. So the shelter itself predicts that there's nothing's going to happen, that you're going to lose that nasty wind. So that's inhibitory conditioning. So the CS is the shelter, the no bitter wind is the US. So it's going to be the absent, or the bitter wind is the US. So in this case, you're going to the conditioned stimulus, that shelter, is going to basically cause you not to produce fear. It's going to cause you happiness and things like that. Why? Because it predicts the lack of something. All right, so here's how it works. Present the CS as normal. CS, the CS plus. Okay, so we got to deal with that now. We got the CS pluses and CS minuses here, so bear with me. The CS plus is the conditioned stimulus that leads to the conditioned response. Okay, the CS plus is what's paired with the US. So that's your excitatory conditioning. So the red light, danger, you get stopping. Okay, so that is so essentially what we've got now is that the red light is going to predict danger. Okay? But the conditioned response is stopping, because that removes the danger. Does that make sense? This is not a great example. Why is it not a great example? Because that's not a classically conditioned procedure. But if you think about the fear involved, it is. All right. So the red light is going to reduce fear if you stop. But see, this is why I say this stuff gets confusing to talk about, because it really does. They all integrate. The fear and stuff like that integrates with an operant response, such as stopping the car and blah blah blah. Anyway, I'm going off on a sidetrack here. So let's look at this from a slightly different example here. So present a second stimulus concurrently. Here we go. The CS plus and the CS minus. CS minus yields nothing. The CS signals that no US will happen. So there's a red light, okay, which is present, but there's a cop standing there signaling that it's okay to go through this, so they're directing traffic, and that's going to yield you driving. But it's going to also, specifically, that fear is going to reduce. That cop is going to reduce the fear. It's okay to go through the light if the cop is telling you to. If not, there's danger. All right. So that cop standing there is a CS minus for fear. Right? So it should be anyway, because the cop should reduce that fear of driving through the intersection if it says it's okay. Now the example over here is another one. All right. So if you see the crazy Denver Broncos doing something, and I'm not sure which way this is going, if that's a block, it's a hit, who knows what it is, but we can make up a story about it, and that's what we're going to do. Let's make up the story from the Broncos' perspective, okay, because I think that shows inhibitory conditioning quite well. So number 27, maybe, the guy on the right there, okay, so the guy on the right, we're going to assume that he's trying to catch the ball. He's not, but let's assume that he is. So if he's getting ready to catch the ball, and he's in the middle of the field, there's a CS plus there, middle of the field. Why? Because if you catch the ball in the middle of the field, chances are you're going to get your ass beat. All right, you're going to get hit hard. Okay, so there's going to be a certain amount of fear associated with catching the ball, going up over the middle, if you will. So, but he sees a block. All right, so right in front of him is a block. So that block is now, which is a hell of a block, is now a CS, is going to be a CS minus, because the block has happened. That's a CS minus, so he should not be afraid of getting hit right now. He should be able to catch that ball freely because that hit happened. So you saw the block, which is going to relax him and allow him to catch the ball, because he doesn't have to fear about the fact that he's going to get hit really hard in about a half a second. Right? So that's how this works, and it really does work that quick. There is no conscious thought going on here. This all happens on a level that you are not aware of. Right? You're not sitting there thinking, I think I'm going to decide for this to be a CS minus. It doesn't actually work. Right? So this stuff happens. It happens whether or not you know about it. You can't stop it from happening. A lot of people go, well, I can control it because I know about it now. No, you can't. I could make you blink your eyes to the sound of that pen, whether or not you wanted me to. All I need to do is get you to sit there for a little bit of a time, blow some air in your eyes while I click that noise, or make that noise, and eventually I could get you to blink your eyes. So, not that I'm going to do that. Let's look at it from a slightly different perspective. A CS minus is essentially just negatively correlated with a US. So, the CS minus basically says that no US is going to happen right now. You're safe. Essentially. So if you think about the guy getting the block for him, right? So the block happens. I'm safe from getting hit for just a moment. It's negatively correlated with that pain of getting hit. So the CS minus presentations, in this case, they're not happening immediately prior to the US presentations. In this case, the US came on first, and then there's a break, and then the CS happens, and oh wow, look, a US happened. But it wasn't really predicted very well by the CS minus, and the CS minus comes on. So again, the CS minus is predicting nothing's going to happen. There's nothing right here, right? There's nothing right here. There's a long delay, and then there may be a US, but nothing is immediately going to follow it. So you're safe for a moment, but as you run down the field, you might get smacked. Okay? So that's in a nutshell what's going on. Classical conditioning. Where is it? Do you see it? Sure. All over the place. Fear. Think of a fear. It's probably classically conditioned. Causal events. Food aversions. Emotions. Emotions can be fun to talk about. I'm not going to get into detail on the other ones there. But emotions are primarily classically conditioned. Think of your favorite song, and you and your partner's special song or whatever it is, right? So the song produces an emotion in you, because it's associated with that person that you care about. And so that's classical conditioning. That song is a neutral stimulus until it gets paired with love or excitement or whatever it may be, and eventually this song will elicit a conditioned response. Same thing with food aversions and so on and so forth. The food in itself isn't going to make you sick, but the food could be paired with sickness, some other type of sickness, maybe the flu, and now you'll no longer like the food, or you will get sick in the presence of the food. There's way more to it than this. If you have any questions, feel free to bring them up in a relevant fashion. End of this one. See you again soon.